The thing with EMDR is many people are using it. It's one.
All the kids are doing it.
All the kids are doing it, but it absolutely is one of those treatments where, I'm being super honest, we don't necessarily know all of the scientific mechanisms by which it seems to be working. I'm just going to say that. There are many other things that I don't know the mechanisms of. Why are you laughing?
I'm laughing because I want to explain the science, even though I know none of the science. Yeah, I mean, the eyes are connected to the brain. You use the eyes to move around. That signal goes into the brain. It clears out the bad memories, and you're better. That's it.
That sounds like Alyssa has agreed to come talk to us because she herself is a current participant in EMDR. So welcome, Alyssa, to the podcast.
Hi.
Alyssa gets to see my breakdown on the daily, but now we're welcoming her to our breakdown. So, Alyssa, I'm going to ask you some questions. You can obviously answer or not answer anything you want. When did you start doing EMDR?
I started about 4 months ago.
And had you ever done EMDR before?
No, I hadn't.
And was there a precipitating event that someone encouraged you to go start EMDR for?
Well, actually, you were one of the people who encouraged me to do it. I had a relatively traumatic experience when I gave birth. And so Mayim had suggested that one of her friends had done EMDR before. And then I just happened to the therapist that I got, it's what she specializes in. So she recommended that I do it because I gave birth as the result of a car accident.
So how did your therapist describe EMDR to you? And there's no right or wrong answer here. I'm just curious, what were you told?
She told me sort of what the process was. So what she said is because I'm still doing therapy virtually, because of COVID. So, she has this little website and it's a ball and it goes back and forth and you watch it move. And then she gives you a prompt. She gave me a prompt of what, some thoughts that were connected to, what I had been experiencing in terms of flashbacks and everything. And she will say that and then just sort of let my brain go where it goes. And she said, I will potentially see physical things, sort of be in the moment, or you might just have whatever thoughts come, and it's just sort of a hypnosis, what your brain brings up.
But you're watching this ball go back and forth.
Yeah.
Okay, so EMDR is eye movement desensitization reprocessing. So you are given there's saccades is what they're called. There's eye movements that you make, that you are encouraged to make. And I'm just trying to understand, and while you're making these eye movements, there's a method of therapy that's going on during that. And the idea is that the stimulation of your eyes moving back and forth and those repetitive movements is creating pathways that help those memories get more appropriately integrated, is a way to say it. Does that feel okay to everybody on this call right now? Yes. Yeah. Or in Jonathan's terms, the eyes are connected to the brain and the brain does things with information.
The eyes are just windshield washering the brain memories away like this. Tick tock, tick tock.
So
take them away.
What were you told to expect? Were they oh, you'll be fine in 3 weeks? Do they give you a time? What were you expecting going in?
I had no idea what to expect, but she did tell me, that it can be very tiring. One, just because it's the eye movement itself is tiring on your eyes. And then she said because it's it kind of brings up a little bit of everything that's traumatic from your past. And it's how your brain, it's how your brain, I call it a free association. So you kind of you're going back to traumatic events that are tied to what had happened to you.
Actually, it happens to be in my thesis because PTSD is a part of my thesis, just because whatever. My thesis has a lot of things. But one of the things that, one of the kind of main PTSD Dr. Ladies, she's out of Israel, has discussed is the fact that, all trauma is linked in the brain. So people who have had trauma are more likely to have PTSD later. So many of us have trauma and it just kind of like lives wherever it lives. And it could be trauma with a capital T, it could be trauma with a lowercase t. There's all sorts of trauma. And depending on how your brain processes things that might not seem traumatic to your sibling feel traumatic to you. It's a very broad, I'm painting with a broad brush here. But the idea is that once those pathways have some stimulation, if something more significant happens that absolutely is going to activate those pathways, what happens is you get this like multiplication of intensity. So what EMDR is trying to do is not create memories that don't exist. It's not like trying to make you hate your parents if you thought you liked them. But what it's doing is it's literally accessing this set of neurological pathways that hold this emotional memory. And there is science to that. This is like one of the things Jonathan and I love to do here. That's not hippy dippy out there. Memories are actually held. They're coded for with with firing of neurons. They are coded for more intensely when there's emotional content to those memories. If memories are painful enough, they will be suppressed. There is actually a system by which the brain goes into a different kind of protective mode. But I just want to clarify that when you say other things come up, that's what can be exhausting, is that things that also you may not have associated with. The idea is not to make you feel more trauma. The idea is to take this pathway and with these distractions, which it doesn't have to be the eye movements. It can be tapping. There's other things. That's the most common. The idea is that we start kind of, as Jonathan said, kind of like wiping the system clean. I've been told by a friend of mine who is the person who first told me about it, she was able to accomplish more, and she's a therapist. She was able to accomplish more in 6 weeks of EMDR than she could have even in 6 months of processing what she was processing.
Yeah, I think like I told my therapist in one of the sessions that like I would never have thought of how I was thinking of these things, if that makes sense, if I hadn't connected it to like, even just like I had a day where I went through other hospital experiences that I had, like good and bad. And like, I would never have connected them to those those feelings had I not had been doing it this way. Cause I think I would have gone in saying like, here's what I'm feeling. This is why it's scary to me. But I also like, there are things that I didn't remember because your brain protects itself. There were things I didn't remember from that event that like came up in these sessions that are small, but you're like, I would never have thought about it because I would have been focusing on the accident itself.
What happened after, right?
Yeah, what happened afterwards, like all of those things I would have just fixated on instead of processing what I think is why it was specifically traumatic to me.
Right.
So it makes it go so much faster. I started to feel better within, I think like 2 months. Like I felt a lot more like in control of how I was feeling.
Right. So I also, my mom had mentioned when my mom has done EMDR and she spoke about it in a bevisode. What she said is there was some event, I don't know, I don't want to know, but there was some event that happened to her. And what she said is when she did her EMDR session, specifically about that, she said it was as if a camera pulled back and she saw all the other aspects of what was happening, like in the room or whatever. And so that's also, that's fascinating. To me as a neuroscientist, that's fascinating that creating this kind of distraction and processing this way they have to be trained specifically for EMDR also. Many therapists, a lot of therapists are, I don't know the percentage, but it is a specific thing they're trained to do. They also have to prep you. It's not just like, hey, nice to meet you, let's do EMDR. Like they have to prepare you. My mom had to do some reading and like about the process and what to expect and all these things. But I remember she described it like that it was as if a camera pulled back and there was like, she said she could almost feel like she was moving around the space, that it happened, which again sounds terrifying. The thing that I wanted to ask, we got a lot of questions, as you saw when you were also going through the questions with us. We got a lot of questions from people about, like, how do I know if therapy is for me, or how do I know when it's time? I want to say that, you are you are an intelligent, articulate, educated person. You come from, a nice family. I think it's important for people to hear that these kinds of modalities, and Jonathan, maybe you can speak to this a little bit, these kinds of modalities that used to be thought of as like for the fringe, like for wacky people, like isn't really working. It is now becoming, I'm not saying you're basic. I'm just saying that, like, it's not like you were raised by like therapists who were immersed in like yoga and meditation. Like, you were a person who was not previously engaging in like this kind of processing, but you were open to it. Jonathan, do you want to speak a little bit to maybe some of that stigma?
I mean, I take away from this when I hear the explanation and that Bev experienced and what Alyssa experienced, and I have my own experience both doing EMDR and other eye movements that have connected to physical responses. And what I sort of lean into here, and again, my explanation is not going to be at all scientific, but that the brain is processing our experiences and stacking them in ways that we still really aren't aware of. There's an enormous mystery still to where things get stored and then how they get replayed. And our experience of how they're stored is the experience of our relationship to them. So when the camera gets pulled back, we're doing something to change our relationship to the way that these experiences are being held by us. And through eye technique, through other forms of intervention, which can be very scientific, they're not, saying a prayer necessarily, although I think there is science behind prayer and faith. We're able to change the organization of these memories, and to change the organization of memory is something that's actually can be quite scientific, and also was previously only left to the realm of mystics because we didn't have any way to quantify it. So now that we're doing this on a much larger level, I think we're being able to bring these tools into the mainstream. People are more able to understand them, and then people are able to shift their relationship to something that would have been, you could have been left in that state just replaying over and over without the tools to get the distance needed to feel better. So, I mean, what an amazing time we're living in that more people have access to this.
Absolutely. And thank you, Jonathan. I don't know if you feel comfortable describing a little bit of what kind of your symptoms were that sort of sent you into, kind of like therapy in the first place. I had a significant, very traumatic car accident. And, for me, it's not that I was replaying it. I couldn't stop my brain from replaying it. And it was happening at times that I would consider were intrusive, meaning it was not an appropriate time for me to be having those memories. Even now I feel like crying. Like it's been how many years? It's been 9 years. I still remember the sound. The sound of an accident is very, very, it got coded really, really strongly. And I remember there was a very specific visual of the first thing I saw, when after the airbag, did its dance. And, then there was this like silence, and I didn't think you could remember a silence the way that I do, but it's a silence that holds a lot of physical memory. And it's like, that's crazy to be able to say, I have a memory that literally is a snapshot. There's no sound, but there's a feeling, right? And I think that's something that's a much more, again, this was the realm of kind of mystics, like that feeling is its own memory. And sometimes all we can access is the feeling. A lot of times with childhood, with abuse, if abuse especially is pre-verbal, you have memories that are feelings, but they don't have necessarily, details like that. So anyway, for me, and you can echo any of this or, add anything, for me, so those are called flashbacks. And what a flashback is it is different than a memory. I love this distinction. A lot of people don't know. Flashbacks are different than memories in that you are placed back in that place. Of course, there is science to it, but whatever feels mystical about that, that's what it feels like. You're not remembering something. You are back there. Your body's where you are in space is there. So that's a flashback. It can be very intrusive. I was very, very, very jittery for quite some time. I acquired a fear of dogs because they moved too quickly for me to track. And I had never been, I once was scratched by a Doberman when I was 7. I'll never forget it. But I wasn't a person who had to cross the street if a dog was being walked on a leash. And I became that person. It was very, very uncomfortable. I didn't drive for 3 months. I didn't sit in a car for 3 months. And, there are different kinds of accidents. And I, had, a significant injury and surgeries and blah, blah. But anyway, I couldn't even sit in a car. When I would drive past that intersection or get near it, my heart would start going. And it was pretty unmanageable. My friend Jacob took me there on the 1-year anniversary of my accident. He drove me there. He happens to be a therapist. He made me get out of the car. It was horrible. It was horrible. I took pictures. It was horrible. I could see why people might turn to drinking or pot smoking with the feelings that were coming up. That was not, for me, that wasn't my thing. I had a very bad startle reflex. And that basically means that the phone ringing would make me jump and sometimes cry. Sirens, things like that. Any or all of those resonate? Are there other, obviously sleep gets disrupted. You can also then get anxious and depressed because everything's so cuckoo. What did you kind of experience?
I definitely had flashbacks. I didn't have the, choice to not drive in a car because we were going back and forth to the NICU, which is another thing that I'm processing with EMDR also. So I was having really bad flashbacks in the car specifically. And also you guys have been in Los Angeles. The people drive crazy. So a lot of what was happening is I was having flashbacks in the car because people were turning in the same way that had caused the accident. So I was having that. And then I was also having a lot of flashbacks to the experience of finding out that I had to have a C-section. That were it was just, they were very intrusive. I couldn't sit still, ever. I was obsessed with cleaning and trying to basically just distract my mind.
Which also when you're a new mom, it's hard to tell what's,
yes,
because some of those things also happen but you have no idea. You're a first time mom and you have no idea. Right. And you also don't have your baby in your home. It's crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't until I started talking to other people that I was sort of starting to be able to separate what people call the baby blues, which that is also a scientific thing. Hormones are all over the place. You're crying more, but I had moved beyond what I think was a normal experience for people. And then I also just remember just not disassociating basically, which is something that is a coping tactic that I have done before for other just panic attacks and stuff. So I was familiar with it, but I was doing it all of the time. So
can you describe for people who may not know what that looks or feels like?
Yeah, it's you feel outside of your body. Because my husband doesn't experience it, so I described it to him.
How nice for him.
I know. As it feels like that, a cartoon where when someone's soul is floating above their body, that's sort of what you feel, where it's you feel present here and you kind of feel present in yourself, but you're really sort of watching everything happen to you, but and not really experiencing it. And I sort of, at that point, I think that was how I was living every day.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. We really appreciate your time. And I know that there are phases, there's usually 8 phases to EMDR. So whatever phase you're in, we hope you move through it swiftly and efficiently. And really happy that you're also feeling, more like yourself, as it were.
Yeah,
but these are all the parts of ourselves. So thank you for sharing with us today.
Of course.
I want to talk a little bit about the science of EMDR. it is one of those. It is a psychotherapy treatment. So if you're like, what is it? What is it? What is it? It's a psychotherapy treatment. And this is from a website that I am using. It's the EMDR Institute. I'm not doing an advertisement for them. It's just I happen to like their clinician explanation. So that's kind of what I'm using. So this was first discovered in the late 80s as a treatment. The idea is that EMDR is accessing traumatic memories or other kind of unpleasant things in order to resolve them, right? So that's kind of the goal. How do we resolve these kinds of memories? During EMDR, you attend to emotionally disturbing material or this event that you're, let's say, tackling. You usually pick one event is how you sort of do an EMDR, while simultaneously focusing on an external stimulus. This could be a visual stimulus, a ball going back and forward on a screen. It can also be, there's also hand tapping, sometimes audio distraction or stimuli are used as well. And the hypothesis as to like, why does this work? What's the science? How does this work? There is a network of memory that is kind of coding for this trauma. And the information processing enhances that and forges new connections that have more adaptive ways of functioning and processing them. So we're basically like tapping into a memory system and then adding a technique to help make that less disturbing. I mean, that's kind of like, I guess, the simplest way to say it. So new associations are made, and that's not an emotional thing. That's we're speaking neurologically, meaning that we're trying to make new pathways, new connections, new interactions, so that we can alleviate distress, or that we can have our distress alleviated or eliminated, hopefully, and also gain what are called cognitive insights. And, those are things like, oh, I hadn't realized this was connected to this. I hadn't realized this also happened. The protocol of EMDR includes the past events that may have laid the groundwork for some issues, the current circumstance that is then tapping into whatever groundwork might have been laid, and then thinking about how the future is going to be incorporated into this system in your brain. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
There typically are 8 phases of EMDR. And just very briefly, and again, do not try EMDR at home. The first phase is where you get to know the therapist and let them learn a little bit about you, because this isn't like I said, it's not like a nice to meet you, let's start this. They need to know triggers for you, a little bit about what your childhood was like. And the second phase is the therapist making sure, this is how it's stated here, that the client has several different ways of handling emotional distress. So I've actually been wanting to do EMDR, and it has been suggested to me that if there are too many other things that you are actively dealing with, emotionally, psychiatrically, that's not the time necessarily to dive into EMDR in addition. So kind of needing to make sure that there are other outlets for coping, and that there feels like enough emotional and brain space to be able to do this. Also, EMDR is a time commitment, especially because you can have kind of an emotional hangover after. So it's not the kind of thing you like do on a lunch hour. Phases 3 to 6 are the actual EMDR sessions. And that's when you talk about the images that come up, what it brings up about you, the related emotions and sensations that come up in your body. And phase 7, they actually call it closure, something that, is it is a psychology term, I guess. And often you're asked to sort of keep a log of anything else that comes up. And phase 8 is, kind of your wrap up, as it were. So that's the phases of EMDR. I hope that's a good and helpful, scientific explanation. There are people who don't believe in it, and that's fine. This is one of those things that you don't have to believe in it for it to work.